Yep.
Yeah, it'll be nice when I have this third bathroom in my house. So I'll finally be able to start using it. It's going to be good.
Here we go.
So, Aubrey and Amber, knowing that we have a hard stop for our work session, I'm counting all 7 council members. So I'm going to go ahead and begin, if that is okay with you.
Go ahead. That's okay with me, Mayor, but I'll just let Aubrey make sure that all of our planning folks are ready.
Looks good to me.
Okay, we're ready to begin whenever you are, Mayor.
All right, thank you all, and welcome to the November 17th, 2020 City Council meeting. Thank you for taking and making the time to spend part of your Tuesday evening with us, and we look forward to hearing from you, those of you who are choosing to make public comment tonight. During the COVID-19 pandemic, council meetings are being held via teleconference to follow physical distancing recommendations from our state's health authorities. We've asked those who wish to speak to pre-register with the city recorder's office, and this is an opportunity for members of the public to inform council about your views. However, council doesn't enter into a dialogue during this time, and attendee cameras and screen sharing have been disabled to ensure the safety of the meeting. Presentations are limited to 3 minutes per person. However, one group presentation with a single speaker that has been coordinated and will be given additional time. So with that, we'll start our meeting and ask for a roll call.
Mayor Calloway.
Here.
Councilor Pace.
Here.
Councilor Allen.
Here.
Councilor Martin.
Here.
Councilor Noctegal.
Here.
Councilor Van Beveren.
Here.
Councilor Alcare.
Here.
Okay, thank you. The first item on our agenda is public comment, and no one has signed up to provide general public comment. We do have a number that have signed up to give a public comment during our public hearing time. If you wish to provide general public comment at a future meeting or submit written comments, you can always email council@hillsboro-oregon.gov, and the email is also listed on the agenda. With that, we'll move on to our consent agenda. And the items, yes.
We actually had one person registered just before 6 o'clock for public comment. Her name is Mariah Wait Calloway. So I'll go ahead and unmute them.
Very good. Thank you.
Good evening, Mayor Calloway and Council. Thank you so much for having me. I wanted to make my public comment on your work session on SROs. I wanted to express concern that this conversation is being led by the police department, and it's very clearly leaving out some key stakeholders, which are Black, Indigenous, and students of color who are disproportionately impacted by the presence of SROs in their schools. This is indicative of concerns around police accountability and police being accountable to police rather than to the community, and we should be centering students in this conversation. There's evidence that the presence of SROs disproportionately harms Black, Indigenous, and students of color, as well as students with disabilities. And it would be very pertinent to have information on this, particularly for Hillsboro. I've seen information for Beaverton and Washington County, but not specific to Hillsboro. In the summer of the George Floyd uprisings, many called in to Hillsboro to express their demand to defund the police. And in the report, after these public comments, these demands were actually erased in the form of stating, categorizing them as transformative changes or major reforms. But the motive to divest from policing and reinvesting in our community was not mentioned at all in this report. I understand that defunding can be an uncomfortable topic, as many people have strong ideas of what that means, but it is absolutely necessary. The measures that I'm seeing right now coming from the city appear more to be rebranding of business as usual. Now is the time for transformative change, and we truly need to think about what actually keeps our communities safe. Some Black, Indigenous, and students of color also circulated a petition that gained almost 1,000 signatures, and their request was to divest from SROs specifically and invest in education and community care. I don't know how much time I have left, but I would like to read some from that statement, from that petition. We demand the city of Hillsboro decrease the size and scope of its police force and reinvest the funds in social programs. This includes mental health professionals, housing, rehabilitation services, among other programs that limit the factors and circumstances leading to crime. Right now, policing covers too broad a scope. Officers are dispatched into situations without analyzing whether they can properly address the need at hand. It would be better to dispatch trained professionals who specialize in a specific area for the calls needed focus. They give an example of calling 911 for a mental health emergency where mental health professionals are not dispatched. One of the programs that must be removed are school resource officers. Replacing SROs with social workers will help students work out their behavioral issues instead of simply punishing them. SROs serve as an intimidation tactic to our students, and their presence often leads to the start of criminal records that are hard to move past. Recently, Portland Public Schools made the decision to remove SROs, and Hillsboro School District, being in a lower crime rate area, should do the same.
Thank you very much. Next comment is from Dirk Knudsen.
Can you guys hear me? Oh, hang on. Sorry, I had to unmute. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I know we got a lot to do, so I just wanted to make a comment that the city and throughout their different agencies and staff are just doing an amazing job through this difficult time. In the last 30 to 45 days alone, I've had interactions both in business and personally with Dan and his staff at economic development for a new company trying to move in the midst of the pandemic, and within a few days they really knocked it out of the park, and we're working to bring that group to Hillsboro in the coming year. And I wanted to thank everyone at planning, because they see me a lot down there throughout the course of the month working on various things. And just in the last few days alone, I've had a number of not only the support staff like Dawn and Gretchen, but also the planners, Leslie, Rachel, and Chris, of course. So I just wanted to recognize those folks for the work they do. And Carla, along with the HDP, has been doing a great job on things downtown. Now that I'm more present downtown, I just love the energy they're trying to bring, and they are bringing. And then had a chance to work with Charlie Shell at engineering, and all of them within a few hours or not more than a day or two got back to me as a citizen, as also a local business person. So in these trying times, I feel like our systems are being pushed, but I think staff's responding, and your employees are doing a great job. And I just wanted to say that because that can often be missed on all of us in times of need. You guys know that, but I wanted them to know that, and just anyone else participating in the hearing. And I work with people in Portland and Tigard and everywhere else in real estate and other matters, and we're really doing a great job. So my thanks to all of them, and in these next few months, let's just keep it going. It's great, and I want to thank them.
Very good. Thank you very much.
You are welcome, Mayor.
Are there any other comments? All right.
Mayor, we have Barb who has raised her hand.
Okay. Barb, you can go ahead. I'll start timing your 3 minutes when you begin.
Okay.
To speak.
Thank you. I wanted to talk about the Orenco or alley renaming, and specifically about the alley renaming in Orenco.
And Barb, if you'd like, you could either speak now or you can speak during the public hearing portion of the meeting.
Whatever is most appropriate in your estimation.
So I think it would probably make more sense to speak during the public hearing time related to that, because it sounds like that's where your comments were going.
Yeah. Okay. So do you want me to just wait and then call on me when that time comes?
That's correct. And Robbie, am I correct with that? Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Barb, we'll put you on the list for comments during that time.
All right. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. Okay. Aubrey or Amber, anybody else?
That is everybody for public comment.
Okay, thanks. So then the consent consent agenda items are normally considered in a single motion. Any item may be removed for separate consideration upon request by any member of council. Does any member of council wish to remove an item for separate consideration? And seeing none, then may I have a motion and a second to approve the consent agenda?
So moved. Second.
Been moved and seconded. May we have a roll call?
Councilors Martin,
Aye.
Allen,
Aye.
Alcare,
Aye.
Pace,
Aye.
Noctegal,
Aye.
Van Beveren.
Thank you. The motion carries. Next, we'll move on to agenda item 3, public hearings, and I'll open the public hearing on items 3.1, which is street name change 001-20 alley naming project. Council will consider adopting a resolution authorizing the naming of 50 unnamed public and 101 unnamed private alleys that are located within the city limits of Hillsboro. Resolution number 2700 is available, and I'd like to invite planning staff to come forward to give an initial presentation.
Thank you, Mayor Calloway. This is Chris Berry on the Development Services team within the Planning Division. We appreciate you and the council's time and all of the residents' time that are here this evening with us. So the 4 members of staff that will be taking you through the presentation this evening are myself, Danielle Comer, who is a database coordinator with the Community Development Department, Chief David Downey from the Fire and Rescue Department, and Lieutenant Dan O'Laughlin from the Police Department. So as we weave through the presentation, and Aubrey or Amber, if you wouldn't mind pulling that up, we will all step in at different points, and at the end, we would be happy to take any questions from the mayor or council. All right. Next slide, please. So just to give an agenda of the staff presentation, these are all the items that we will be covering. It is a lot of information to get across. There has been a fair amount of public testimony and a fair amount of questions asked of this project. So we are going to do our best to try to encapsulate as much of the information here in a very succinct way so that Mayor, Council, and the residents can get all of that information during our presentation. So there's a lot of words to this presentation. We have tried to weave in and through the presentation graphics of alleys and other situations throughout the city, so that we're breaking up the words but also giving you all the context of the physical space that we are encapsulating with this naming project. Next slide, please. So first and foremost in our minds was recognition of the public testimony that's been received to date. And as the City Council knows, there's been a fair amount of public testimony related to this project. Staff is going to respond in detail throughout the staff presentation. However, we felt it was necessary to start and acknowledge the lack of proactive communication ahead of the public notice being sent out to the affected property owners in late October this year. I am sorry that we didn't communicate earlier and with more details to the affected property owners to make them aware of the project. It's important to remember that there will be a transition period for the affected community members, and city staff will support those affected property owners throughout the process, like we have done through the Connecting Hillsboro Address Project. Other components of the testimony listed here on the slide, such as the chosen alley names and the timing of the project, would likely not have changed the substance of staff's recommendations on the project, as we will cover throughout the staff presentation. So also worth noting that the testimony that you all have seen has both been in opposition, which has been the majority of the testimony, but there also has been testimony in support of the project.
Thank you. I'll put it with the other one.
Next slide, please. So to go to the broadest level for our city and just touch on where the effort really stems from. And this is the basis for what started the Connecting Hillsboro Address Project is the 2020 Vision and Action Plan. And in that was a strategy that was agreed upon by the community, supported by the council, and that was to develop a common Hillsboro address for every home and business within the boundary of the city, reflected in all postal addresses. So again, that was the basis of the Connecting Hillsboro Address Project, and also continued to be the basis of us moving forward with this alley naming project. Next slide, please. So this is a very wordy slide. It covers text from the Hillsboro Municipal Code that we thought was relevant to show this evening because we have received a couple of questions about where the regulatory guidance comes from for this project. So the street naming guidelines in Hillsboro Municipal Code are found in subchapter 9.24. So this first point about definitions is covering how the municipal code defines street. And so the emphasis is added here on public or private ways. So that's important because you are considering the official naming of both public and private alleys this evening. So it's important just to highlight that the municipal code is what gives us the direction to move forward with both types of roadways. Also in the municipal code is how we are to designate different types of streets. So alleys are required to be designated as a lane per the municipal code. And then building back off of the visioning plan and establishing Hillsboro specific addresses, the foundation of that is where our grid is based off of for addressing. So this section about geographical prefixes establishes that that grid is essentially downtown Hillsboro, where traditionally, prior to Connecting Hillsboro Address Project, the grid was based off of downtown Portland. So this slide is just highlighting text from the municipal code that provides that regulatory guidance for us as staff to move this project forward and put it in front of you for your consideration. Next slide, please. So we're going to cover a fair amount of history in a couple slides here. So we thought it was useful to go back and just touch briefly on the Connecting Hillsboro Address Project. So City Council in February to October 2016 approved very similar applications, the official street name change applications for all three phases of the Connecting Hillsboro Address Project. And one of the goals that was established through the resolutions that the council approved was the goal of implementing a consistent street grid to reduce confusion and response time for emergency responders. So Chief Downey and Lieutenant O'Laughlin will cover that in greater detail when they speak, but just that's a foundational element for both CHAP as well as the alley naming project. Then a couple quick other points on this project. December of 2016 is when the first round of address change notification letters were mailed out, and then transition periods began to end in 2018. So these were the dates by which residents and business owners, depending on their phase, were required to have new numbers up, addresses changed with their billing, etc. So it's these dates are relevant later on in the presentation, but just a succinct explanation of that project in its totality. So we are nearing the end of the Connecting Hillsboro Address Project at this point. Next slide, please. So in December of 2017, so this was while the Connecting Hillsboro project was in its implementation, after the council's approval of that project, there was an unfortunate incident through 911 where there was some confusion about from dispatch to the emergency personnel responding that made it difficult for those people to connect. So After multitude of staff heard that 911 call, city management directed staff to form the address committee and really get through a lot of the nuts and bolts of the Connecting Hillsboro Address Project, but also there is a large amount of work that this committee has done since January 2018, not directly related to the Connecting Hillsboro project. And that's done through monthly and sometimes even weekly meetings to address all topics related to addressing. So this has become very large discussion within the city. We spend a fair amount of time on it because of its importance, and you'll hear that importance reiterated through this presentation. And it was July of 2018 when the committee first identified that the alleys in the city were not legally named and that there was a need for us to move forward with a project such as the one that is in front of you this evening. There was an intentional decision made by the committee at that point in time, because we were still in the full implementation phase for Connecting Hillsboro Address project, to not move the alley project forward at that time, so that we were ensuring that we had enough bandwidth with staff to do both projects, but also not impacting the community all at the same time. So that was an intentional move. If we can move to the next slide, we'll cover a bit more of the history and get into really what elevated the priority here. So I'll turn it over at this point to Chief Downey and Lieutenant O'Laughlin to cover the majority of these points.
Thanks, Chris. Mayor, members of the council, we appreciate the opportunity to explain a little bit about the alley naming project and addressing and how important it is to our response and public safety. I can speak to the first couple of bullets here on this slide. We were made aware in May of 2019 by one of our lieutenants. We were dispatched to an address near Baseline and 12 that was actually off of an alley south of Baseline. It took us a little bit longer than expected to find the address. Nothing critical came as a result of that call, but we realized that there was a little bit of a concern that we had something addressed off of 12th Street that was not fronting 12th Street. And then we didn't know in August that we had an issue until the Humphreys family came to the council in November of last year and explained to us what happened at 151-6 and how police and fire were both dispatched to a cardiac arrest call. And if it wasn't for the member of the household waving us down from the alley, we might not have found the home. We did struggle to find the home. We did get there and provided the medical care that we could. But she gave some very compelling testimony at the council meeting last year that really started to drive this project forward, especially from the public safety standpoint. What we did in public safety immediately is we started using a pre-planning and mapping software to provide an interim solution. That interim solution does not have any naming capacity to it unless it's already a mapping layer that exists. What we've basically done is we've actually drawn outlines around all the structures that we believe would be misidentified if we were dispatched to them. So we did a pretty comprehensive look at the downtown area and really outlined as many buildings as we possibly could identify that we perhaps might be misled to. That has worked fairly well, but again, what we're trying to do here is avoid being reactionary as we move forward as a city. We really want to be proactive, which is why we very much support moving forward with this change in both alley naming and alley addressing, which I'll talk specifically about addressing here in a slide coming up in a couple of moments. So, I'll keep you anything to add.
No, I think we can hand it back to you, Chris, and then we'll come in on our upcoming slide.
All right, thank you. So from late 2019, from the period that Chief Downey just covered, to just about 2 months ago, the committee, and give credit where it's due, Danielle Comer specifically did a tremendous amount of work to get this project prepared for public hearings. And that involved a lot of coordination, communication within the city, but also with Washington County and 911 dispatch to make sure that we were as comprehensive with our approach as we possibly could be. Next slide, please. So more recent timing on the application itself. So just quickly cover some of the logistics behind an official street name change application. So the first step in that process is that staff will put an initiation request in front of the Planning Commission. They are required to take a vote to initiate the application before it moves on to the City Council. Planning Commission did that on September 23rd. On October 20th, you all set the public hearing for this evening. There was a staff report that was available to the public for that October 20th meeting as well as the September 23rd meeting. Now, granted, those staff reports, while they were available, there had not yet been a public notice that was sent out. Public notice was not required to be sent out until the hearing date was actually set. So once you all set that hearing on the 20th, a week later, the public notice was then sent out to affected property owners. And when we say affected property owners, there was a total of 4,300 properties that received the public notice for this project. The determination on who was affected were property owners that fronted, had access to any public or private alley that is part of this project. So pretty significant mailing that went out in late October. And then on November the 10th, and I think that there has been a bit of confusion, and likely you'll hear some public testimony verbally tonight about the staff report when that was available. So the staff report was ready by the deadline that was listed on the public notice, which was 4 p.m. on November the 10th. As you all know, the packet doesn't get posted online until the Thursday preceding your hearing. So I think there was a bit of confusion on the mix-up on those dates, and I would say that some of that confusion could have been created purely by the language in our notice, which staff is going to revisit because it seemed like it created a fair amount of confusion on this one. But nevertheless, the staff report was available by that deadline that was identified in the public notice that was sent out. And since that initial staff report was issued, public testimonies continued to come in, and staff has continued to pull that together, and just today issued a supplemental staff report for the council's consideration, as well as just a recognition to the public that submitted that testimony. So if we can move to the next slide, and I'm going to turn it back over to Chief Downey and Lieutenant O'Loughlin.
Just to give you a little bit of history, in the first quote they're talking about the need for timing. I just want to repeat, we want to be a little bit proactive in our approach here. We've been reactive with what we learned in 2019. And as an example of a couple of neighborhoods, there's been a lot of public testimony from the residents in the Stonewater Homeowners Association. In one of their emails to me specifically, they asked for a little bit of data associated with these are the 320 emergency calls are only fire and EMS associated calls. So I don't want to mislead anybody that those also involve police calls. We've been there over 300 times over the last 10 years. What's interesting to note is in 18 of those 300 plus calls, the 911 caller advised us to access their property from the alley side of the structure because their address faced either a courtyard or some other green space, that the street was actually an alley behind their residence, and they directed us to respond on that unnamed street. So there have been some examples of time where we've been directed away from the front of the structure because the street is not named and they preferred that we use the alley. It's been interesting. Lieutenant O'Loughlin and I, one of our deputy fire marshals, and myself spent Wednesday morning walking through this particular neighborhood and really got an idea of how confusing it can be at times. One of the things that was most confusing for us is a pattern throughout the city when it comes to addressing is that even numbered addresses are going to be on the south or the east side of the street. Odd numbers are going to be on a north or a west side of a street. So our responders know, based on the last digit in that numerical address, sounds pretty simple, but what side of the street we can find the structure. We found in a couple of these particular subdivisions, this one included, that you have odd numbers on both the east and west or north and south side of the street. That doesn't sound too confusing in a non-emergent circumstances, but those are typically the situations we find ourselves in. And it would be very confusing to a responder to look in an alley and see an odd numbered address on both sides of what looks like a street. So not only are we asking for support on not only naming of alleys, but also readdressing as appropriate to where we stay consistent in the city, where the odd and even numbered addresses would be posted on those particular residences.
And take off my mask just in case those need to see my lips moving. Good evening, Mayor and council members. I am Dan O'Loughlin. I'm a lieutenant with Hillsboro Police and been working on this team to assist. Just want to give a brief perspective from the police perspective for the address change and why we also, just as Chief has articulated, find it to be important. So I'll try to give you a glimpse, a snapshot in regards to how I believe this change can improve our officers' performance. With that said, I can't go any farther without saying that I fully understand and am very sympathetic to the citizens that will be affected or could be affected by an address change and or the naming of alleys. As a police officer, for the past 20 years within Hillsboro, I'm very dedicated to this city as well as the officers that work with me in regards to trying to provide the best service we can and respond with a very timely and effective manner. So just as the chief has stated, where they have challenges in responding to some addresses due to the numbering system or the lack of naming of alleys, we as police officers, we have those exact same challenges. I can tell you in my long career, I've worked in patrol. Yes, it's been a number of years ago. But with that said, I've worked on many specialty teams and specialty units within the law enforcement community as well. And having accurate addressing with numbers and with the listing of alley names is critical for us to be successful. And as you know, in this time, in our history in law enforcement, there's no better time than for us to try to be better. And this is our effort. While we understand there's difficulties, we want to be better, and this is how we think we can be better. So with that said, yes, just as the fire department has technology to assist on getting to calls, we do as well. But for the police department, it's not necessarily on a typical call where things can become more critically important on the naming and the numbering of an address. It's when calls become dynamic, when calls become what we consider to be priority 1 or priority 2 calls. Those types of calls that we deem to be life-threatening to either an officer or to a member of our community. Those high-level calls are the ones that technology sometimes gets pared down, and radio communication on our radios becomes critically important. In this slide, if you can see it, and I hope it's not too small on your side, you'll see that we have a snapshot here of an overhead view of one of our communities that will be affected by the proposal that we're putting forth. You'll see here that we can, if you can see it, and I don't have my glasses on, so I'm squinting a bit too, but you'll see that we have Northeast 73rd Avenue running north and south on the far right-hand side of the page. Inside the center of that whole residential area there of homes, you'll see that we have at the very top what we call unnamed alley number 1. Down below we have unnamed alley number 2. Both those two alleys are running east and west in direction. You'll then see 2 other white markers that say unnamed alley number 3 and unnamed alley number 4. Those alleys are running north and south. So if you look at our PowerPoint to the side, I have the bullet points there of K9 tracks, foot pursuits as the first couple bullet points. I want you to think, please, if you would, in the perspective of an officer who's responding in this area and has what we would consider a negative event that's occurring where he may have to be or she may have to be involved in a K9 track after a suspect or in a foot pursuit after a suspect on North northeast, say 73rd. If that officer is communicating that on the radio, we're fairly successful being able to hear that and understand where they're going. I'm running southbound on that street, 73rd. If that officer articulates, I now had to make a westbound turn into an unnamed alley, it then becomes very difficult, as you can see in this diagram, how would we, those other officers that are responding to assist that officer or assist a citizen that needs help knowing which alley they're actually in that's running east and west. Things get exponentially worse if that officer, say, was to turn into alley number 2. Say I'm running westbound in that alley. We don't know which alley they're in. They then articulate, I'm now running southbound in another alley. Very hard to tell if they're in alley number 3 or 4. These are things that I can tell you in my career and speaking with officers currently on the road and that have responded to calls in these districts that are affected in this change, that they have had these struggles and they've had these concerns. Yes, we police officers, you hear, will run into chaos, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that we don't get scared. And I can tell you from my firsthand experience, there's nothing more scary than hearing an officer who needs assistance or hearing of a citizen who needs assistance in a network like this, and we don't know exactly where they're at. The additional points here of traffic stops, that can be obviously another very high-risk thing for us as law enforcement officers. More officers are injured in that. As a high-risk perspective, having to turn into alleyways that aren't named can be very dangerous for us as well. The last point, specialty team responses. I have hostage negotiations. For example, when we have a situation that may evolve in one of our neighborhoods where we have to be focusing on one residence, the communication that occurs is critical in regards to us understanding exactly which residents we're dealing with. We don't have that, and we don't want to have error in regards to which is the address that we're actually having to deal with. So for those specialty teams like SWAT, like hostage negotiators, and the patrol officers, it's critical for them to know, and having alleyways named as opposed to not named is definitely beneficial to us. With that said, can we say, just as Fire Above had their information there in regards to calls for service, yes, we do have calls for service in these residential areas. There's a lot of areas obviously affected with this change throughout the city, but we've actually, for the police department, looked at 3 different developments. One being that of Arbor Roses, 2 being that of Stonewater community development, and also South Hillsboro. I was able to have our Hillsboro support staff provide us with intel in regards to the numbers of calls for service in those 3 areas alone, just within this year in the past 11 months. Within the past 11 months, we've had 653 calls for service in that area. And like I said, I've talked to officers who've struggled on K9 deployments for tracking through these alleyways and through these neighborhoods, and officers in actually successfully getting to an address as quickly as possible due to the current address system. Of those 653 calls for service, not all of them would require us to necessarily get there in a matter of minutes or seconds. But I can tell you that of our priority 1s and 2 calls, in those 3 developments alone, we have 90 calls for service this year. Those are high priority calls that require us to be going to a call to try to save someone's life or to assist an officer in saving their life. That accounts for approximately, within those 3 developments, anywhere from 11 to 15% of our call load is those high priority calls that we don't have the opportunity to miss in regards to where we're going. With that said, I understand also that with this, as I said before, this comes with a lot of difficulties for the citizens as well. I merely give a perspective of how I believe we can do a better job for our community. And with that, I say there may not be necessarily a perfect solution, but once again, I say we're really just trying to be better. Thank you.
Thanks, Lieutenant Laughlin, Chief Downey. So one other point to touch on with this aerial up, because we do have another aerial stonewater at a later slide, but if you can see the area between what's identified as unnamed alley number 1, unnamed alley number 2, there are 2 strips of land running east to west in between the homes. So that is privately owned green space. So the homes in the majority of this community, their front doors face that privately owned green space. So that'll be an important piece to touch on when we get to a later slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so name selection and the process that we went through to pick the names for this project has been a lot of the feedback that we have received. So first thing to point out that is the baseline for the start of our process was that we started with a pre-approved list of names that comes from, that's a long set of words here, but the Washington County Consolidated Communications Agency. It's also acronym referred to as WACA, but for this evening we'll just refer to them as 911 Dispatch, because I think that that's probably the easiest way for everybody to understand that part of the energy and effort and collaboration of a project like this, and most of all the address-related topics that we discuss have some component that we need to communicate with 911 Dispatch to make sure that we are aligned, because that is the critical component to get right. So Danielle in particular spends a significant amount of her time communicating directly with 911 Dispatch staff in all of these efforts. So the parameters and recommendations that were set for the project and that we're putting in front of you all this evening for consideration with the names that have been chosen. First, not to allow duplicate names within Washington County. So I think that that's a point to stop on, that this is not just a citywide look, that we are looking at streets within our own city to say these are duplicates, or they could have possible multiple spellings. We're needing to look at that county-wide. So that is the effort that we go through with 911 Dispatch. So you can imagine how many streets there are in Washington County, and how much of a limitation that puts to have to be considerate of all those names. So also not picking or allowing names that are difficult to pronounce. So that's important for 911 Dispatch. Also the residents, property owners that may be calling in, to make sure that the words that we are using for these street names are easy to pronounce, so that there's not a miscommunication. Another point here that has been a large part of the public testimony is that we have made an intentional effort through this project and through other citywide naming efforts to not name city infrastructure such as streets and alleys after people or places. There are a variety of reasons behind that. The council will have a more in-depth conversation about the citywide naming policy at a later date, but we did follow general guidelines from the evolution of that policy internally with staff, and one of the main things there was not to name these alleys after people or places. And
I have a comment, if I could just make it on. I appreciate what you're presenting here, and I don't know that this can be fixed at this moment, but I'm looking at this and I'm getting the sense that this is reflecting English names, and that I'm looking at this as names with possible multiple misspellings and names that are difficult to pronounce. So I'm just raising this up and just calling this out as an equity issue, because I need to understand what those names are that are the ones that are difficult to pronounce. I'd like to know why. I'd like to know why. And you don't have to answer this right now, but I'm just bringing this up as an equity issue. Why would we only approach it from the sense that we can pronounce English words better and easier than others? My street, for example, is not an English street. It's not an English name. And so I have to spell it all of the time because people don't know how, they don't know how to pronounce it. That's including police that I've, called to come here. But I'm just pointing this out, and I'm raising this to council's attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Arquette. I would like to relay to you that the equity team here at the city has had interaction on this project. The citywide naming policy is where most of the effort from that team has been focused. The discussions that we've had as a committee about names, and this wasn't directly related to the points that you were raising on English, Spanish, or other languages of names that might have multiple spellings, might be difficult to pronounce. That wasn't necessarily, we weren't looking at that through the lens of other languages. It would only be other languages that these categories would be covered. I would tell you that there was a pretty thoughtful conversation within the committee about deviating from kind of the standard of using completely English names for a project like this. And there was a bit of concern from the committee to use an alley naming project while as kind of our first step as a city to get into that, seeing as though alleys might not be seen as the highest priority of city infrastructure to start naming after. So that was a discussion and a consideration that the committee did weave in throughout the months of work that we were working through this project.
Yeah, I appreciate the work of the equity team. I'm on city council and I'm having this reaction to what I'm seeing. So I'm going to speak on behalf of people in the city who are not going to understand the intricacies of how this was discussed by the equity team. So I'm saying this is a perception. Thank you.
Councilor Arquette, if I could also add as well, I think in talking about names that are difficult to pronounce, I think it's important to also clarify that's actually, from my understanding, a recommendation from WACA, from 911, because when those names get relayed over radio, it becomes much easier if it's a simple name, and if it's a name that has people don't know how to pronounce it properly, it may delay or cause confusion in 911 response. So I think that's an important part of this as well.
Yeah,
Okay.
I understand that. But still, I understand that, but it is a challenge with equity.
All right. So the final point relative to parameters was that the alley names be less than 10 characters, and we have a slide that'll explain that in a little bit greater detail. Next slide, please. So examples of conflicting street names. This is a Google Street View from Magnolia Street in the city of Cornelius. So this is an example of a street that creates concern with utilizing Magnolia in a different way within the city of Hillsboro, since that name has already been assigned to a public street in Cornelius. And these are just a couple of other examples in other cities in and around our area that are important just to point out that a lot of these names have already been chosen. Next slide, please. So the number of characters is important. This was a directive from our Public Works Department. So as we thought through the signing of these alleys, the amount of space that will be available for the signage, so the street signage that will identify these alleys, is going to be much more limited than the space that might be available for larger street signs and signal poles and such. So Public Works, through multitude of discussions, asked us to keep the list to 10 characters or less. You can see the difference in size between a sign that would have more than 10 characters versus one that is less. And when we say characters, we're not talking about the prefix or the suffix. We're just talking about the main street name. So, in this scale, it doesn't seem that large, but if you can imagine, Von Neumann, Northeast Von Neumann Drive is a 5-foot wide sign. That is a very large sign, and if you have a pretty tight area for an alley and you're putting one of these signs right at the corner, a sign like this might actually start restricting some of the access to and from that alley. So that was why we were intentional about limiting it to 10 characters or less. Next slide, please. So, comparison on scope between the Connecting Hillsboro project and the alley naming project. So, the Connecting Hillsboro project, and for this slide, I'll just refer to that as CHAP because I'm going to say it a couple times, was a much larger project in terms of its scope, impact, etc. So there was over 200 streets renamed as part of CHAP. A key component here, and this pulls back into the effort that we went through with picking new names for this alley naming project. With CHAP, there was only 5 new street names assigned. So that meant, even though that was a much larger effort, much more impact, staff only had to come up with 5 new street names as part of that project. The rest of the street names were either numbers or changing the prefix. So in terms of selecting names, it was a much smaller effort than this project where we were required to pick over 150 new street names. Then in terms of the number of affected addresses, CHAP, much larger. There was about 11,000 addresses that were affected through that project. So that multi-year effort with the transition periods was intentional because of such a large impact. This alley naming project, what staff is recommending is a 1-year transition period for these 300 addresses that are affected. So getting back to the amount of properties that received public notices, so that was 4,300. So 300 of those is about 7% that are impacted by a change in address through this project. And then of those 300, there are some properties, unfortunately, and we've been aware of this since pretty early on in the project, there are about 5% of those 300 properties that had their address changed by the Connecting Hillsboro Address Project that are also going to have their address changed by the Alley Naming Project. So, that is, a tough burden that we are placing on that 5% of affected properties, and we understand how heavy of a burden that is, and we have talked with a couple of those homeowners about that burden. Next slide, please. So, similar to the Connecting Hillsboro Address Project, the council's decision direction to us as staff, if you were to move the alley naming project forward, there is a set of implementation steps that comes after the council's decision. So, after your decision, there's still a fair amount of refinement that staff needs to go through, and by refinement, that's where are we going to place the actual street signs in individual neighborhoods? Do we have sign easements for those? Is it public right of way? Do we need to go secure easements? That kind of thing. So these are not abnormal implementation steps to be taken after the council's decision. Part of this effort would also be staff connecting with the neighborhoods, probably all of the neighborhoods that you will hear from this evening, because there are nuances in all of these neighborhoods. Some of them already have address signs that they have privately installed throughout their community, so we would need to talk about updating to those signs as well as the updating to any of the individual residences. So there's, some communication that staff would need to do as an implementation step, and we're looking at February for that. And then in the spring is when we would aim to have the address change letters sent out. So that's when the transition period would start. And part of this overall effort is ensuring that our GIS data, so our mapping data, is updated. We share that data out with other governmental agencies. All of city staff has access to that updated data. We also push that data out to the third-party navigation systems, Google, Apple. They, unfortunately, as our community has experienced in the implementation of Connecting Hillsboro, those third-party navigation systems don't consume the data as quickly as we provide it to them, so that does create some issues with those systems not being as up-to-date as our own system is. But again, first and foremost, with updating our GIS data is making sure that our city services are provided, and especially that our emergency personnel can find these properties. And then the remainder of 2021 would be the fabrication and installation of street signs. And some nuances to point out here that were covered in the staff report is the fabrication and installation of street signs would start with all improved public alleys, so public alleys that have an improved surface, and any private alleys that have existing development access. So there may be public alleys that are not yet improved, so we don't want to yet sign those until they are improved and there's development off of them, as well as private alleys that may already be improved but may not need an address off of them, so we would not go and sign those quite yet. What's important to point out here is that the burden and the cost associated with installing these signs will be a city cost. We will not burden the public with installing, fabricating these street signs that identify public or private alleys. Next slide, please. So these are graphics showing a couple of examples that will hopefully address some of the questions that have come up. So the example on the far left, this is an existing, all of these are existing conditions. Far left is Edison and 4th. As you can see, the very generic address of 123 Northeast 4th Avenue is how the accessory dwelling unit on the rear of that lot is currently addressed. So in this scenario, because the alley that runs on the south side of that property where that accessory dwelling unit gets its direct access from is not yet named, what we have been doing in assigning addresses is we assign the address off the nearest cross street. So that's why that accessory dwelling unit has an address off of 4th Avenue. Moving into the middle example, so this is a closer view of the Stonewater community, and on the top of the address, actually where the numbers are listed, 123 Northeast 73rd Avenue, is that privately owned green space. So these homes have their front doors facing that green space. The rear and the garage face this unnamed alley. Right now, this property, similar to that accessory dwelling unit, has its address off of the nearest cross street, so Northeast 73rd Avenue. And then the third example to the far right is another community in Hidden Creek, where the residence has its front door facing Northeast Caddis Drive. The rear, the garage, faces a private alley. So this property is addressed off of the street that it fronts because it has direct access and frontage on Caddis Drive. So the next slide is going to show what these situations will look like once the project is approved. So now you're seeing in this slide that all these examples are now with named alleys. So far left, that alley becomes Northeast Dusk Lane. Then that accessory dwelling unit gets its address directly off of Dusk Lane. Middle, that alley becomes Altamont Lane. That unit gets its address directly off of Altamont Lane. Then the far example on the right, because that, even though the private alley behind those residences was changed to Lark Hall Lane, since that unit still faces Caddis Drive, its address will not change. So those are just three examples to pinpoint some of the questions that have come up about why we would need to change the addresses of properties that have their garage facing these alleys. It's less about the fact that the garage faces the alley and more about the fact that the front door does not face or have frontage on a public street or any kind of public way. So that's why there's a need in these situations for us to not only name the alley, but then also readdress the property off of that named alley. Next slide, please. So to run through these quickly, the council and public were provided with a variety of maps through the public notices that really showed snapshots of these different neighborhoods where the alleys are changing. But we wanted these next three graphics just to give you a scale and a geographic context of citywide. So we've broken it down into 3 geographic segments. So this is downtown. The alleys that are being impacted are there in the orange and blue color. Next slide, please. And then the southeast part of the city, again, there's coloration of the alleys that are being impacted. Next slide, please. And then for the northeast, so this is the Urenco town site and Urenco neighborhoods and surrounding area, the alleys that are being impacted there. Next slide, please. So next thing to point out is that, as Lieutenant O'Loughlin and Chief Downey had indicated, we have been reacting in a lot of ways because there have not been official alley names provided throughout the majority of the city. It's definitely worth pointing out that we learned the lesson along the way, and so for new neighborhoods, this is a snapshot aerial of the Reach Crossing neighborhood in South Hillsboro. So we have learned that we need to officially name the alleys. So through the subdivision and platting process for the neighborhoods in South Hillsboro, those alleys are being named through that process. So they are not part of this project that's in front of you tonight. This block that's being highlighted here is a good example. So you can see that the alley officially named that runs on the north side of this block of properties is Southeast Firefly Lane. All of these properties that are indicated in the red block are addressed off of Firefly Lane, and that is how those projects were approved and how they've been developed and how they've been addressed. So similar situation with these properties where their front doors, you can see the white lines that come from the south side of those homes, their front doors face the greenway. So this is the major greenway component within the Reach Crossing development. So these homes have their front door facing that greenway, but their primary vehicle access comes from Firefly Lane. So all of these homes have been addressed off of Firefly Lane. And the next slide is just going to show a picture of that condition and what that street sign looks like and what those homes look like and what the alley looks like. So again, just some context physically for what these spaces look like in the city, and that we have gone through a proactive approach in South Hillsboro and now in any new neighborhood that's coming in, proposing alleys to make sure that those are legally named through the land use and permitting process so that we are not putting ourselves back in a situation to need to bring a similar project like this to you in the future.
Chris, can you please go back one slide? Thank you. So if a police officer were to be called to one of these homes, they would follow the address, so they would show up at the garage door, right, in the back, as opposed to the front door?
I would ask Lieutenant O'Loughlin to answer that. I suspect it depends on what the caller is indicating, where they are located and where the emergency is. But Lieutenant O'Loughlin, if you don't mind.
Yes, sir. To answer your question, if it was an officer who wasn't familiar with that addressing for that neighborhood and they were relying more on their mapping technology in their car, they would more likely than not land on the backside of the residence. Yes. The nice thing in that neighborhood is that with the gate accesses, I believe it's like fire type accesses, there's accesses that run the length of all of those residents to gain us access into each one of them.
Okay. It seems to me in this situation, in this picture, that it would make sense, since there is, a road and not a green space in front of those front doors, that's where the address would be named.
So, Councilor Allen, it's an oversized walkway that you might see on the south side of those homes. the vehicular where vehicles can
Gotcha.
travel
I was
is on.
looking at the ones just north. I apologize.
Oh, yeah. So just north of this block, those homes face Chinkapin Drive, and their addresses are off of Chinkapin.
Okay, so that makes sense to me. Thank you.
And just to add to that, sir, yeah, with the addressing that Fire and I looked at, in essence, your front door does access out to a main road, then you would maintain keeping that address. Your address would not change. It's really for those lots that are not having a front door that's accessing out onto a main road. I think that goes towards your question a bit.
That does. Maybe it's a bigger conversation about how we develop these communities in the future, but it seems to me that we should design the homes, front door to be facing the front of the street and just make that consistent. But
Yeah, that is a broader discussion, Councilor Allen, about design standards. South Hillsboro, especially in Reed's Crossing, was intentionally designed with alleys being very much a part of the access and the design of that overall community.
I just want to ask Council if you hold off asking any more questions because we have our hard stop. Roughly at 7:25, we have about 45 minutes of public testimony that has signed up, and that we obviously we won't get to all of it before the 7:30 stop. So I want to be respectful and try to get as much public testimony in as we can. So Chris, if you can, get through the rest of this, as quickly as you can. And I apologize, I don't mean to be rude by asking you to rush.
No worries, Mayor. That is actually the end of the staff presentation. So.
Okay.
We are ready for questions or.
Perfect. What we have, with folks who are registered to speak, I think what we'll do is we'll take as much public comment as we can until about 7:25. I think then we will I'll ask for a motion for a continuance to our next meeting. So for those who are signed up for public testimony, thank you for your indulgence. We had a work session scheduled with our school board, and it's the first time we've had a school board council joint work session in ages. And so we anticipated that an hour and a half would be enough to get us through this agenda item. Clearly, it won't be. So I'm going to start calling names, and you've got 3 minutes each. If you don't need all 3 minutes, that will be great. If you are willing to wait until the next meeting to give your public testimony, that will be wonderful, and then we'll just, that way get to as many people on the list as we possibly can. Any questions from staff or from council about this? And I'll make sure, council, you get all the questions for staff answered, at our first meeting in December.
This is Olivia. Can we take down the presentation?
Sure. Perfect. All right. So, I think then we're good to move forward. And the first several people I have, first of all, is Shannon Humphrey, then Barbara Chapnick, then Callie Goldfield, and Mary Lane McNeely. And if any of you are willing to wait until next week, or next meeting, just let me know when, when you are, your microphone is unmuted by Aubrey. So we'll start with Shannon Humphrey.
I just unmuted a Bill Humphrey. I'm assuming that's also Shannon Humphrey since I don't see a Shannon on the list.
Okay, well, I'll tell you what, let's move on, and Shannon, if you can email and let us know that you're here, because you are critically important for all of us to hear. Let's move on to Barbara Chapnick.
Yes, I'm here.
All right, would you like to go ahead and speak tonight?
Yes, I would.
All right, we'll give you 3 minutes. You may begin.
My name is Barbara Chapnick, and I represent myself and other owners in the Stonewater Association. We do support the efforts of the city to increase the ease at which emergency responders can locate people. However, the stated scope given to us feels very inefficient. After reading through the submitted written testimonies, it appears there are three main areas of concern by owners. One, carriage-type owners who support alley naming address changes. Two, owners who merely do not like the names given to alleys. And three, owners whose sole access is not via an alley but would have their address changed. We at Stonewater fall into the third category. Stonewater has 22 private alleys in our property, and many of our front doors face courtyards. However, many of those homes do not have gate access next to the garage door. Rather, their access is on the second floor. That's where their patio is. Therefore, first responders would not have immediate access to all our homes. The project states properties whose access is solely from an alley will receive a new address off the alley. We understand how carriage-type houses need proper addresses, but we do not fall into that criteria. Is it the city's intent to only change addresses to those residences whose sole access is via an alley? Because of the lack of clarity in this project, we are concerned that your scope is much broader, and I was told by Daniel Comer last week that if this project is approved, owners whose front door faces a courtyard would have street name changes to reflect the name of the alleys, and our street number may or may not be changed. We find this hard to imagine that this is the true intention of your project. Emergency responders, as well as our groceries, FedEx, and other delivery services would now be going to a garage door where there is no other access. This would also bring trucks parking in our fire zone and increase thefts in our neighborhood. How would this increase safety for our community? So I repeat my question again. Is the city planning to change addresses to all owners who have alleys, whether or not their property access is solely from an alley, or just give alley names? If your intent is only to change addresses to those whose sole access is from an alley, then we at Stonewater should be exempt, since none of our homes in the courtyards have sole access via an alley. If your intent is to assign new addresses to any courtyard homes where their front door does not face the street, we really oppose this project, although we're supporting you giving our alleys names, but don't make my front door the alley. We hope under these circumstances you will pause this project to reconsider its scope. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Chapnick, and thank you for nailing that 3 minutes. Callie Goldfield is next. And Callie, would you like to speak tonight or at our next meeting?
I would, but I will be very, very brief because I'm also from the infamous Stonewater.
Okay, all right.
I didn't realize someone was already speaking for all of us, otherwise I would have joined. I also just kind of want to reiterate the points that Barbara so eloquently put together. One of my house that I own, the front door faces the courtyard, but I have no access to my property from the back, only a garage. If my address was changed to be the alley facing, any deliveries would be dropped off at my garage, but there's no security, no coverage from the elements. Anyone coming to my house, friends, delivery, things like that, they'll be sent to my garage. And even a first responder, I would have to be in a position where I could go open my garage door for them. If I'm injured or unable to do that, they wouldn't be able to get into my property through that way. So I agree with Barbara. I would prefer my address not changed, but I understand the difficulty for first responders navigating those alleys. So I have no issue with the alley naming itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, Ms. McNeely, and it says Mary Lane. I don't know if that's supposed to be Mary Jane or Mary Ann or Mary Lane, but Ms. McNeely, if you're ready to go.
Hi, it is Mary Lane.
Wonderful,
and
thank you.
yes, I'm actually here to speak on behalf, and I'm going to step outside, of two young citizens who live in my neighborhood. We are in Magnolia Estates, and we sort of made a civic engagement project out of your alley naming project, and their only request, they are 6 and 7, Jack and Addie, was that we take into consideration with the alley naming the character of the people they've come to know within the community where we live. And so for them, it was they had some specific requests for the names, and I will be sure to go through and do a little bit more research with them, given the feedback from the city about some of the considerations with not wanting duplicate names and character limits, to make sure that they fit in those guidelines. But my only request would be that if for some reason the names that they submitted could not be accommodated, that maybe somebody from the council or Mayor Callaway, if you could just write them a letter or an email letting them know. They've been super excited about this project, and they ask me about it at least once or twice a day. And so I really want to support their initiative and excitement in engaging with the city in which we all live. So thank you, guys.
Oh, thank you. I think you're going to have about 7 city councilors who are going to show up at your house wanting to talk to the kids. So thank you very, very much.
Well, we would love that. They would love that.
Well,
of course. Thank you.
We couldn't have all of us. That would be a quorum and mess up with our public meeting law. So we'll have to divide it out.
One at a time. One at a time. Yeah, there you go.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
You bet. Next is Dr. Lubisher. Would you like to speak tonight or next meeting, sir?
Tonight would be good.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Go ahead.
Good evening. You have my written testimony. My primary reason for public comment tonight is to suggest to council that those historical areas of our city that have special street names that reflect their history, such as Old Orenco, that consideration be given to having those alleys nearby also receive historically reflective names. All streets in Old Orenco are names of trees. Now, you'll have different recommendations, but hopefully my recommendation in my written testimony suggested that we name the alleys using the same names as the street names, but with the word alley replacing the word street. And so for example, the alley south of Alder Street would be named Northeast Alder Alley. However, the code requires alleys to be called lanes. I understand that now, thanks to Barb Greenberg. So I would change my recommendation to using, say, Northeast Alder Lane, Northeast Birch Lane, etc. And I think that may work out just fine. That's my suggestion. My second comment is with regards to the implementation step regarding spring of 2021 address change letters sent out and update city's GIS data. I think that updating the GIS data is important, and I hope that we can update it regarding the change in the numbered streets. We have on Quatama Street, we've changed the numbered streets north-south to different numbers, and GIS still uses. Anyway, if somebody could contact me on that, because we have a lot of delivery trucks that end up on our driveway and they're confused. The GPS doesn't work. I guess it says city's GIS. Maybe I wrote that down wrong. Anyway, that's all. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. So next we have Mary Hoffman and then Randy Van Cleve.
Yes, this is Mary Hoffman.
Yes, ma'am. Would you like to speak tonight or next?
Yes, I would. Yes,
Okay.
I'm with the Arbor Roses development. We have 18 private alleys. We have a similar situation in many properties. What was discussed with Stonewater, with the properties facing a green space and with no access from the alleyways, except for opening up a garage. We had some discussions on our Facebook pages, and one of the issues that we found was that all our streets are named after roses. It's arbor roses. And we would prefer that the names of the alleyways be names of roses. For one thing, one of the things that we've been talking about, we need short names, we need common names. One of the proposals was for one of the east border of the development was Cliffwood, which is, first of all, not a rose, but something like a heritage rose. You know, something that fits in with the other names so that it's not jarring. And I personally hated many of the names. They're very white bread. We've got one of our streets is Alika, which is a Nigerian name. And so I was looking before I found out it was roses to see what are some Nigerian words that we could use. Something that recognizes that we're a diverse community. Something that makes people feel happy to drive by our alley signs. If we have the street names, they should be some relationship to the existing streets nearby, not jarring. And I have what is the consideration? We have street numbers already painted behind the garages in those alleyways. How is that going to affect, will the emergency vehicles be able to identify the locations? There's numbers there. Are they numbers in the lane? You know, how is that going to work? I don't know if that's been addressed. But the main thing with our group is, first of all, we were not contacted till very, very late. And we want it to be rose names is our concern. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, Mr. Van Cleve, Randy Van Cleve. And would you like to speak tonight or wait until next meeting?
I'll go ahead and speak tonight.
Okay.
Thanks for your time. Thanks for your time. I'm a little surprised at the presentation, as was acknowledged by the project manager. There was no socialization at all to the 4,300 properties or the 300 people who would really be affected. So it's kind of hard to narrow down the input directly to you folks. My concerns are on mainly two areas. First, I live in the Stonewater subdivision, so I appreciate all the focus on our neighborhood. I didn't happen to meet the two emergency personnel on Wednesday morning that were in the neighborhood. So let's see, let's start with changing my address from the design front of our house to the alley access to our house. We have over 300 townhomes in Stony Brook, with the majority of them on Stonewater, on fronting the private space versus the private alleys. Access through our private alleys to the home would require us navigating across our planting beds, 5 foot on a couple of stepping stones, through a wrought iron gate fence, across the patios that have all sorts of natural furniture on them, up to a 6 foot sliding glass door. No porch, no entryway on that porch, no overhang to provide protection from the weather, no doorbell. They were not designed for any kind of entry and would likely have to be reconfigured, because that is now this property's address of record, and that's where people would go. In addition, all of our alleyways are fire lanes, so you can't stop or park in an alley. Changing these addresses would cause a lot more traffic down all our alleys. All our alleys are not created equal. Mine happens to be very narrow and a dead end. No alley, to my knowledge, was designed to meet streetlight criteria, curbs, turn radiuses. Our garages, our properties are a mere 5 feet from the alley, so you can imagine the chagrin if a delivery vehicle, Amazon, FedEx, whatever, is coming down the alley, and they're typically in a hurry. They have schedules to meet. Or two-way traffic, how do people negotiate that in some of these alleys? That's a concern. So safety, and people, if you're coming out of your garage or a child is scooted underneath an opening garage door into the alley, that's a concern for commercial vehicles. In fact, that was cited to me as a concern for the other initiative that's going on where the city is now preventing the garbage trucks from accessing any of our private alleys. So they're trying to improve safety using the same set of seemingly mixed rationale. So it's the safety of the people in the street and the fact that our rear entries would have to be significantly modified to accommodate people. Our garages tend to be filled with cars or treasures, so that too is not an option. The real option is a designed front entry that has all of those things built into it. I see I'm past my 3 minutes, so I will thank you.
Very good. Thank you, sir. Our next and last speaker tonight will be Julie Keo Hokalole. I hope I spelled that or pronounced that at least closely enough that you can recognize yourself. So you're speaking on behalf of the Autumn Creek HOA. So when you speak on behalf of a group, we allow you 7.5 minutes. If you don't need all of those 7.5 minutes, Julie, then we'll squeeze Barb Greenbaum in, as I had made a promise that I may not be able to keep, that she'll be able to speak tonight. So, Julie, anytime you are ready.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
We sure can. Thank you.
Okay. A couple of things from the presentation that I'd like to point out in direct relation to our development. We are literally on the border of Beaverton and Hillsboro off of 185th. Our homes went through an address change in 2018. And Chris said that 300 homes are being changed during this project and 5% are having a double change. Just to let you know, that's 15 homes that are going through a double change, 12 of which come from my development. To say the least, this is not a pleasant experience for us, since we still haven't been able to get Google to recognize our addresses. Social media does not recognize our addresses. I talked to Colin Cooper, your director, yesterday. He was one of the people that created our development 10 years ago, and he knows and understands it. Our alleys at that time were signed. They come off of a main street. They were signed. They were easily shown with signs as to what addresses were down them. He remembers them quite well and is very familiar with the fact that Google is a private company and their platforms do not don't work with the city. They're refusing to see these city changes. Google Maps shows our addresses from the first address, the second address, and now a third. It is super confusing. If you rename our addresses without being able to get these private companies to update their systems, the emergency personnel might be able to have their system that can find our homes, but delivery companies won't. Mail, yes, gets forwarded. We're not concerned about that. We have had so many problems with package deliveries since the change of address 2 years ago. We feel we're a unique situation in that we are one of the only developments that are having to change our address twice. We also have, 2 years ago, the city took down our private alley streets signs and put up green permanent street signs. I have been told that when they're green, it states and comes across as it's an address that's recorded with the county, it's an acceptable address. When I inquired upon it with Chris and Danielle, I was told that they made a mistake. The city made a mistake and shouldn't have changed our signs. They misled us by leading us to believe it was a one address change and done. Now we're being told we have to change again twice. That's unheard of for me. I've talked to so many homeowners that
don't ever go through an address change once in their existence.